August 12, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The newly captured airstrip still bore the scars of hasty Japanese evacuation, abandoned construction equipment, scattered ammunition crates, and the acrid smell of burned fuel hanging in the tropical air. Private First Class Robert Martinez stood his post at Checkpoint 7, the northernmost entry point to the airfield perimeter, where the jungle darkness pressed against the American defensive line like a living thing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martinez had landed with the 1st Marine Division just 5 days earlier, part of Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive against Imperial Japan. Now, in the pre-dawn hours, he faced a problem that no amount of training at Camp Lejeune had prepared him for. 3 mud-covered men emerging from the jungle, claiming to be stragglers from Baker Company. Their uniforms looked right. Dog tags dangled from their necks. They carried M1903 Springfield rifles, standard Marine issue. They spoke English. But something felt wrong. Martinez tightened his grip on his weapon, his pulse hammering in his ears. The lead soldier stepped into the dim light of the checkpoint lantern, his face exhausted, his voice hoarse. Second Lieutenant William Hayes, Baker Company, 3rd Battalion. We got separated during yesterday's patrol. Lost radio contact. Need to report to command. The story was plausible. Units had been scattered across Guadalcanal's dense jungle since the landing. Communications remained spotty. Marines were still finding each other, regrouping, establishing proper defensive positions. But Martinez had heard the warnings during yesterday's briefing. Japanese intelligence operatives, trained to speak English, were attempting to infiltrate American lines. Some had lived in the United States before the war. They knew American culture, American slang, American baseball statistics. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. How could a 20-year-old Marine from El Paso, Texas, distinguish between a genuine American officer and a Japanese infiltrator who had spent years perfecting his English? The answer would emerge not from documents or interrogation, but from the fundamental structure of human language itself, from sounds learned in childhood that the adult brain could never fully replicate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The infiltration threat that confronted Martinez that August morning had been years in the making. In 1937, as tensions between the United States and Japan escalated, Japanese military intelligence initiated a remarkable program. They identified young soldiers with linguistic aptitude and natural acting ability, then sent them to American universities under civilian cover. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto had been among the first recruits. In the autumn of 1937, he arrived at the University of Washington in Seattle, officially enrolled as an engineering student. His father, supposedly an export businessman, was actually a Japanese intelligence officer. For 4 years, Yamamoto absorbed not just English, but American culture. He attended baseball games at Sick's Stadium, memorized the batting averages of Pacific Coast League players, learned to differentiate between Seattle and Portland accents. He watched American films, studied American advertisements, practiced American gestures and mannerisms. The program's architect, Major Kenji Nakamura, had himself studied at the University of Southern California in the 1920s. According to intelligence documents later captured by American forces, Nakamura understood that language proficiency required more than vocabulary and grammar. It demanded cultural immersion, the absorption of countless unspoken rules that governed American social interaction. By December 1941, when Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of peace, approximately 200 operatives like Yamamoto had completed their training. They spoke English with remarkable fluency. They could discuss Clark Gable's latest film, debate whether Joe DiMaggio deserved his 56-game hitting streak, and explain the difference between the American and National Baseball Leagues. They had absorbed American culture so thoroughly that they thought they could pass as Americans. They were wrong. But they wouldn't discover their fatal flaw until they faced sentries like Robert Martinez at checkpoints across the Pacific Theater, where a single word would expose the limitations of even the most intensive language training. The problem revealed itself in the days following the Guadalcanal landing. On August 14th, a patrol near the Lunga River encountered two men in American uniforms, claiming to be Army Air Corps personnel separated from their unit. The patrol sergeant, a veteran of peacetime service in Shanghai, felt suspicious. The men's story seemed too rehearsed, their English too carefully pronounced. He detained them and called for the battalion intelligence officer. Captain Thomas Bridwell arrived within the hour. A former high school principal from Portland, Oregon, Bridwell had no formal intelligence training, but he possessed something more valuable, a teacher's instinct for detecting memorized recitation. He engaged the detained men in casual conversation about their supposed hometowns, their families, their experiences in training. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. The men answered every question. They knew American geography, American military protocol, American and cultural references. But Bridwell noticed something subtle. Their pronunciation was too precise, too careful. Native English speakers, especially enlisted men under stress, didn't speak with such deliberate articulation. They slurred words together, dropped syllables, used contractions instinctively. More tellingly, when Bridwell used certain words in casual conversation, words containing multiple L sounds like literally and illegally. The men's pronunciation shifted almost imperceptibly. The L sounds became slightly harder, more tap-like, closer to R sounds. A native English speaker wouldn't notice in normal conversation, but Bridwell, listening specifically for pronunciation anomalies, caught the telltale difference. The men were Japanese infiltrators. Under questioning, after their cover collapsed, they confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. Japan had invested years preparing operatives to penetrate American lines, gather intelligence, and spread confusion. The infiltrators carried forged documents so authentic they would pass any visual inspection. They wore genuine American uniforms taken from casualties. They had memorized elaborate cover stories. Everything about their preparation was sophisticated, professional, and nearly perfect. Nearly perfect, because there was one thing they couldn't fake: the unconscious pronunciation patterns established during childhood language acquisition. The challenge facing American commanders across Guadalcanal was immediate and critical. If infiltrators could pass visual inspection, carry authentic documents, and speak fluent English, how could sentries make reliable identification decisions in seconds, often in darkness, often under the stress of potential combat? Traditional password systems had already proven inadequate. The Japanese had captured or killed American sentries, extracting daily passwords through interrogation or simply overhearing them at checkpoints. Documents could be forged. Physical appearance meant nothing when the enemy included second-generation Japanese Americans who could look ethnically Japanese while being completely American in language and culture. Even extended conversation could be fooled by well-trained infiltrators. Colonel William Friedman, chief cryptanalyst for the War Department in Washington, received urgent requests from Pacific commanders in late August 1942. They needed a verification system that couldn't be compromised through capture of documents or observation of procedures, something that tested not what infiltrators knew, but what they fundamentally were at a linguistic level. Friedman assembled a team that included linguists, anthropologists, and military intelligence officers. Dr. Margaret Reynolds, a linguist from Columbia University, provided the crucial insight. Language acquisition during childhood, she explained to the team in early September, establishes phonetic categories in the brain that remain remarkably stable throughout life. Adult language learners can achieve impressive fluency, but they almost never fully replicate the automatic pronunciation patterns of native speakers. The team began analyzing the specific phonetic differences between Japanese and English that would be most difficult for even trained speakers to overcome. The research revealed a critical vulnerability. Japanese possesses a single liquid consonant, represented in romanization as R, but pronounced quite differently from either the English R or English L. Linguistically, This Japanese sound is classified as an alveolar tap. The tongue quickly taps the ridge behind the upper teeth. English, by contrast, has two completely distinct liquid sounds. The L sound requires placing the tongue tip against the alveolar ridge, while air flows around the sides. The American R sound is produced with the tongue pulled back, not touching the roof of the mouth at all. For native English speakers, these sounds are as different as B and P. For Japanese speakers, both English sounds fall within a single perceptual category. This wasn't a matter of physical inability. Japanese speakers could physically produce both sounds with training. The difficulty was perceptual and automatic. When processing spoken English, the Japanese brain categorized both L and R as instances of their single liquid phoneme. Under pressure, fatigue, or time constraints, trained pronunciation would fail, and automatic native patterns would emerge. The military application was obvious. Challenge words containing L sounds, especially multiple L sounds in rapid succession, would expose infiltrators regardless of their training or preparation. The pronunciation wasn't under conscious control. It would betray them. By September 19, 1942, Marine commanders at Guadalcanal had implemented the new system. Sentries received lists of challenge words specifically chosen for their L-sound content. The words needed to appear in natural conversation, sound authentic as military passwords, and contain enough L sounds to make correct pronunciation by Japanese speakers nearly impossible. One word emerged as particularly effective, though its documentation in the historical record remains frustratingly incomplete. The word was Lollapalooza, an American slang term meaning something outstanding or extraordinary. It contained 4 L sounds in rapid succession at syllable beginnings. Lollapalooza. For a native English speaker, the word rolled off the tongue naturally, if somewhat unusually given its informal, almost playful quality. For a Japanese speaker attempting to produce 4 distinct L sounds rapidly, the word was virtually impossible. Master Technical Sergeant James W. Hurlbut, a combat correspondent with the Marine Corps Reserve who had landed with the assault forces, later provided direct testimony about the practice. In an interview recorded on March 10, 1943, Hurlbut explained, "We always had passwords, including the letter L, because L was thought to be hard for the Japanese to pronounce since there is no L in the Japanese vocabulary." The documentation of Lollapalooza specifically comes from journalist Oliver Gramling's book Free Men Are Fighting: The Story of World War II, published in 1942 by Farrar and Rinehart. On page 315, Gramling wrote that sentries would use a shibboleth such as Lollapalooza, and if the first 2 syllables came back sounding like roar, the sentry would open fire without waiting for the rest of the word. The effectiveness of the system became apparent within days of implementation. On September 23rd, Corporal David Mackenzie at Checkpoint 4 near Henderson Field encountered 3 men approaching from the jungle perimeter. They carried proper identification, wore authentic Marine uniforms, and spoke English with what sounded like Midwestern accents. "Rough night out there?" Mackenzie asked conversationally, following the new protocols that emphasized casual dialogue over formal interrogation. The lead man, identifying himself as Sergeant Robert Thompson from the 7th Marines, nodded wearily. "Lost contact with our platoon during yesterday's action. Command sent us back for resupply and orders." The story sounded plausible, but Mackenzie had attended the briefing about linguistic verification. He'd practiced with other sentries, learning to listen not just to what was said, but how it was pronounced. He incorporated his test word naturally into the conversation. "Man, this whole situation is a real Lollapalooza, isn't it?" Mackenzie said, keeping his tone casual. "Can't tell if we're advancing or retreating half the time." "Yeah," Thompson replied. "Real lol." He paused almost imperceptibly. "Roarapalooza." The L sounds had shifted. They'd become tap-like, closer to R, produced with a single quick tongue motion rather than the sustained lateral airflow of proper English L sounds. Mackenzie caught it immediately. His hand moved to his rifle. "Say that word again for me, Sergeant." Thompson's expression changed. He recognized he'd been discovered. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Thompson reached for a concealed pistol. Mackenzie fired first. The checkpoint erupted in gunfire. When the smoke cleared, all 3 infiltrators lay dead. A search of their bodies revealed detailed maps of American artillery positions, sabotage equipment, and personal papers so expertly forged they would have passed any documentary inspection. If Mackenzie hadn't caught the pronunciation error, the infiltrators would have penetrated American lines, gathered intelligence, and potentially caused significant casualties. Word of Mackenzie's successful identification spread rapidly through Marine units at Guadalcanal. Within a week, similar incidents occurred across the island's perimeter. At Checkpoint 9, Sergeant Thomas Briggs used aluminum as his test word, asking a suspicious soldier to comment on aluminum mess kits. The infiltrator's pronunciation aluminum exposed him immediately. At another checkpoint, a sentry used illegally in conversation. The approaching soldier, claiming to be a military police corporal, pronounced it with 4 tap sounds instead of 3 distinct L sounds. He was detained and, after his cover collapsed, provided valuable intelligence about Japanese infiltration procedures. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto learned of these failures during a September briefing at Rabaul, the Japanese base in New Britain. Major Nakamura's face was grave as he addressed the surviving infiltrators. The briefing was conducted in Japanese, abandoning the constant English immersion the program had maintained. "The Americans have adapted," Nakamura explained. "They're using linguistic traps, words specifically chosen to exploit phonetic patterns difficult for Japanese speakers. We've lost 19 operatives in the past 6 weeks. Most were detected during checkpoint verification procedures." Yamamoto felt a chill despite the tropical heat. He'd considered himself among the program's best-prepared operatives. His 4 years in Seattle had given him near-native fluency. He could discuss Northwest timber camps, Seattle neighborhood rivalries, and Pacific Coast League baseball with authentic knowledge. But he now understood that his fluency had limits. The L sounds he'd practiced thousands of times in training couldn't overcome the tap articulation his brain had established during childhood in Kyoto. The question was no longer whether the infiltration program could succeed, but whether any of them would survive its inevitable conclusion. The autumn of 1942 brought desperate evolution to Japanese infiltration tactics. Captain Hiroki Tanaka, who replaced Nakamura after the latter was killed in an American air raid, understood that direct linguistic confrontation had become impossible. In an October briefing at a converted bunker on New Georgia Island, Tanaka addressed his remaining operatives with brutal honesty. "We must acknowledge reality," Tanaka began. "The Americans have identified our fundamental weakness. Traditional infiltration, depending on verbal interaction, is no longer viable. We must adapt." The new tactics focused on situations where speech could be minimized or avoided. Infiltrators would impersonate wounded soldiers, using bandages around faces and throats as justification for inability to speak clearly. They would target isolated positions where guards might be less vigilant. They would carry forged medical evacuation orders, claiming throat injuries or combat trauma affecting speech. The adaptation showed initial promise. In late October, 2 infiltrators successfully penetrated American lines on Russell Islands by posing as shell-shocked soldiers being escorted to medical facilities. Their escorts, sympathetic young Marines who had witnessed genuine trauma cases, didn't press for verbal verification when the patients could only whisper or shake their heads mutely. But American intelligence adapted just as quickly. By November, new directives required that wounded or traumatized soldiers claiming inability to speak be held at secure facilities until identities could be verified through alternative means. Medical personnel received training to distinguish genuine combat trauma from deception. Written tests were introduced, requiring soldiers to write answers to questions, a method that revealed different types of linguistic knowledge. Sergeant Walter Johnson, manning a checkpoint on Tulagi Island in early November, encountered this new phase of the infiltration war. 2 soldiers appeared, supporting a third man between them. The wounded man's face was wrapped in bandages, his throat apparently injured. "What happened?" Johnson asked the escorts. "Grenade blast," one escort explained, his English accented in a way Johnson couldn't quite place. Battalion aid station said to get him back to regimental medical. Might lose his voice permanently without proper treatment. Johnson nodded but didn't immediately wave them through. Following updated protocols, he requested written documentation. The papers appeared legitimate, properly formatted evacuation orders signed by a captain whose signature matched records Johnson had seen. Still, training had taught him to trust his instincts. "I'm going to need him to write some information for me," Johnson said, producing a notepad and pencil. Standard verification, unit designation, service number, hometown, just to keep records straight. The wounded soldier took the notepad. His hands trembled, whether from genuine injury, fear of discovery, or theatrical performance, Johnson couldn't determine. Johnson dictated several simple requests. Write your full name, write your hometown and state, write your mother's maiden name. The soldier wrote carefully. The handwriting showed typical American letter formations, with no obvious tells of someone educated in Japanese writing systems. But the man hesitated over certain details. More tellingly, when asked to write his high school name and the year he graduated, the soldier's pause grew pronounced. These weren't facts that could be prepared without knowing which specific American identity would be tested. Johnson called for backup. The subsequent investigation revealed all three men were Japanese operatives. The escorts had been trained to provide verbal answers, while the wounded man maintained his silent act. Their exposure led to another tactical evolution on both sides. By December 1942, according to intelligence summaries documented in Pacific Theater Command reports, the infiltration program had suffered catastrophic losses. Of the original cohort of over 200 infiltrators trained before the war, fewer than 60 remained operational. The combination of linguistic verification, cultural testing, and increasingly sophisticated security procedures had transformed what began as a highly successful intelligence operation into a near-suicidal mission. The broader implications extended beyond individual checkpoints at Guadalcanal. Major Peter Caldwell, a military psychologist attached to Pacific Command, studied the lasting effects of the infiltration campaign on American troops. His research, eventually published in classified military journals and later declassified in the 1970s, documented what he termed verification anxiety, a persistent psychological state where soldiers became hypervigilant about identity. Private First Class Michael Torres, serving with the 1st Marine Division on Bougainville in mid-1943, kept a diary that illustrated this psychological burden. "We test each other constantly now," he wrote in June. "Someone coughs, and immediately 3 guys ask him to pronounce Lollapalooza or name the Three Stooges. It's like we've forgotten how to trust our own brothers." The Japanese don't even need to infiltrate anymore. They've already gotten inside our heads. The Japanese military, meanwhile, faced its own crisis. The infiltration program's failure represented a significant intelligence defeat. More damaging was what it revealed about American adaptability and the effectiveness of cultural identity as a defensive tool. Colonel Tetsuo Sugimoto, who assumed command of intelligence operations for the Imperial Japanese Navy after the program's dissolution in March 1943, wrote in his private journal, later captured and translated by American intelligence, about the broader implications. "We underestimated not just American linguistic diversity, but their willingness to weaponize their own cultural identity. They turned something as simple as pronunciation into an impenetrable barrier. This suggests a strategic sophistication we failed to anticipate." The verification system, while undeniably effective in protecting American forces, operated in a moral grey area that became more apparent with historical distance. The system worked by exploiting something individuals couldn't control: the automatic phonetic patterns established during early childhood. It was efficient, relatively humane compared to more violent security measures, and strategically sound. But it also reduced human identity to testable linguistic markers, creating an environment where pronunciation could determine life or death. Colonel Edmund Morrison, now overseeing counter-infiltration operations across the Solomon Islands by January 1943, grappled with these implications. In a confidential memo to Pacific Command dated January 15th, he wrote, "The infiltration threat has forced us to confront a fundamental question: what makes someone American? We've found the answer isn't in paperwork or physical appearance, but in the unconscious patterns of language and culture absorbed through living in our society. This is a different kind of warfare, fought not with weapons but with words." Morrison's memo concluded with a recommendation that linguistic verification remain part of standard military security procedures, a suggestion that was implemented and continues in modified form in modern military operations. The immediate effectiveness justified the practice, but Morrison understood the darker implications. If pronunciation defined American identity for security purposes, what did that mean for loyal American citizens whose speech carried accents from other linguistic backgrounds? The question became particularly acute regarding Japanese Americans. While the linguistic verification system successfully detected Japanese nationals attempting infiltration, loyal American citizens of Japanese descent faced discrimination and suspicion, despite their perfect command of American English and culture. Sergeant Daniel Inouye, serving with distinction in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, later reflected on this painful irony. While he and thousands of other Japanese-American soldiers fought heroically for the United States, the 442nd would become the most decorated unit in American military history. Their families faced imprisonment in internment camps at home, and their ethnic heritage made them automatic suspects in Pacific security operations. Inouye could have passed any pronunciation test designed to detect infiltrators. His English was native, his cultural knowledge authentic, his loyalty unquestionable. Yet the same security apparatus that used linguistic patterns to protect American forces contributed to a broader climate of suspicion that enabled one of America's greatest civil rights violations. The Military Intelligence Service Language School, which trained over 6,000 Japanese-American soldiers as translators and intelligence specialists during the war, represented a counterpoint to the infiltration story. These Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese-Americans, provided critical language support throughout the Pacific Theater. They interrogated prisoners, translated captured documents, intercepted radio communications, and provided cultural insights that proved invaluable to Allied commanders. For pronunciation testing purposes, these soldiers would pass L-based challenges automatically. Their linguistic identity was American, regardless of ethnic heritage. This demonstrated that the verification system tested language background rather than race or ethnicity. But the distinction, while theoretically clear, became blurred in practice. The correlation between Japanese citizenship and Japanese language patterns meant that ethnicity often served as a proxy for linguistic testing, contributing to broader discrimination. The final major infiltration attempt using linguistic deception occurred in April 1943 on Rendova Island. 3 Japanese soldiers, among the last trained infiltrators still operational, attempted to reach American artillery positions to gather targeting intelligence. They carried meticulously forged documents, wore authentic Marine uniforms, and had rehearsed their cover stories extensively. They made it through 2 checkpoints using carefully prepared explanations. Their English was excellent, their cultural knowledge impressive. They'd studied the previous failures, practiced L-sound pronunciation until it sounded acceptable to their own ears, and prepared contingency stories for various questioning scenarios. At the 3rd checkpoint, Corporal James Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas, engaged them in casual conversation while checking papers. The lead infiltrator had identified himself as Private William Foster from Ohio, separated from his unit during patrol operations. "Man, what a Lollapalooza of a day," Rodriguez commented naturally, using the word that had become synonymous with infiltrator detection. "Rain, heat, mud, just a real Lollapalooza." The infiltrator, whose training files later revealed he had studied English for 8 years and spent 2 years in California before the war, attempted the word carefully. "Yes," he replied, "Lollapalooza indeed." The slight mispronunciation was enough. The first 2 syllables had come out with tap sounds rather than true L articulation. Rodriguez immediately signaled for backup. The infiltrators, recognizing their exposure, surrendered without violence, a rare outcome in these confrontations. Under interrogation, these final infiltrators confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. The program was finished. They were among the last operatives still attempting missions. Their capture effectively ended the infiltration campaign that had caused such anxiety in the first years of the Pacific War. As spring 1943 brought the infiltration program to its conclusion, the psychological impact of the threat continued to reverberate through military operations. The hypervigilance that had developed among American troops didn't immediately dissipate when the threat diminished. Soldiers continued spontaneously testing each other, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that persisted long after it served any protective purpose. Lieutenant Thomas Caldwell, conducting psychological evaluations of combat troops, rotating through rest areas, in mid-1943, documented cases of what would later be recognized as a form of collective trauma. Units that had experienced infiltration attempts or false alarms developed persistent distrust that affected unit cohesion. Some soldiers reported difficulty relaxing even in secure rear areas, constantly monitoring the speech patterns of those around them. The infiltration threat created a pervasive uncertainty about identity, Caldwell wrote in his July 1943 report. When you can't trust your eyes or even extended conversation to verify who's American and who's enemy, you develop a fundamental insecurity that persists even after the threat passes. The psychological cost of the infiltration campaign may ultimately exceed its material impact. For the Japanese military command, the program's failure had strategic implications beyond intelligence gathering. The infiltrators had been intended not just to collect information, but to spread confusion, lower morale, and create fear within American units. In this psychological objective, they had achieved some success, but at catastrophic cost in trained personnel. More significantly, the failure revealed limitations in Japanese intelligence preparation. Despite years of training and sophisticated cultural immersion, the infiltration program had underestimated the deep structure of language acquisition. Major Nakamura's approach, brilliant in many respects, had assumed that dedicated study could replicate native fluency. The assumption proved wrong, exposing a fundamental misunderstanding of how humans acquire and process language. The technical lessons of the infiltration war proved invaluable for post-war military and intelligence operations. When the Defense Language Institute was formally established in 1947, incorporating earlier military language schools, its curriculum reflected insights gained from the Pacific Campaign. Dr. Margaret Reynolds, who had been instrumental in developing the linguistic verification system, published groundbreaking research in 1948 titled Language as Defensive Barrier, Phonetic Identity Verification in Warfare. Her work, conducted at Georgetown University with support from the newly formed Department of Defense, documented how the infiltration threat had advanced understanding of language acquisition, phonetic patterns, and cultural linguistics. What we discovered during the war, Reynolds wrote, was that language proficiency exists on multiple levels: surface, fluency, vocabulary, grammar, basic, pronunciation can be achieved through dedicated study. But deep fluency, the unconscious command of phonetic patterns established in childhood, resists even the most intensive adult learning. The Japanese infiltrators achieved remarkable surface fluency, but their deep phonetic patterns remained Japanese. Reynolds's research established principles that influenced fields ranging from immigration security to forensic linguistics. The concept of using cultural and linguistic verification spread beyond military applications. In the immediate post-war years, as Cold War tensions emerged, intelligence agencies developed sophisticated verification techniques based on the World War II Pacific experience. The Central Intelligence Agency, formed in 1947, incorporated linguistic analysis into its counterintelligence protocols. The principle that cultural knowledge absorbed through experience differs qualitatively from knowledge acquired through study influenced security policies across government agencies. Border control agents received training in cultural questioning techniques. Security clearance procedures incorporated linguistic evaluation. For the veterans who had served at those crucial checkpoints, the memory of the verification system carried both pride and somber reflection. Corporal David Mackenzie, who had detected one of the first infiltrators using Lollapalooza in September 1942, returned to Milwaukee after the war and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. In a 1968 interview for a local newspaper veterans feature, Mackenzie finally discussed that night at the checkpoint. "I was 20 years old, scared out of my mind, and responsible for determining who was American and who wasn't," he reflected. The fact that a single word could mean the difference between life and death, for me, for the infiltrator, for everyone who might have been hurt if he'd gotten through, it's something I've thought about every day since. Mackenzie's reflection captured the moral complexity of the verification system. While undoubtedly effective in protecting American forces, the program operated on the assumption that certain linguistic patterns defined American identity. It was an assumption that, however practically necessary in wartime, raised uncomfortable questions about belonging and identity. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the few infiltration program survivors, spent the remainder of the war in conventional military service, never again attempting to pass as an American soldier. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, he was interviewed by American military historians, providing insights into the program's training and operations. "We believed fluency meant mastery," Yamamoto reflected through an interpreter in a 1946 interview. "We learned every American expression, studied every cultural reference, practiced until our English sounded native to our ears. But we failed to understand that true native fluency isn't learned, it's lived. The difference between studying a language and growing up speaking it proved to be the difference between our mission's success and failure." The word Lollapalooza entered American linguistic history as an example of how everyday language could serve strategic purposes. Linguistics textbooks began citing it as a case study in phonetic difficulty. Military historians included it in analyses of unconventional warfare tactics. In popular culture, the term became associated with clever problem-solving and American ingenuity. Yet, as World War II receded from living memory into history, the story of Japanese infiltrators and the verification techniques used to detect them faded from public consciousness. The episode's significance, however, extended far beyond its immediate wartime context, influencing military doctrine, intelligence practices, and understanding of cultural identity for generations. In 2003, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans mounted an exhibition titled The Shadow War: Infiltration and Identity in the Pacific Theater. The exhibition, curated by Dr. James Robertson, brought together declassified documents, veteran testimonies, and linguistic analysis to tell this largely forgotten aspect of the war. Among the exhibition's most powerful elements were recorded interviews with surviving participants from both sides. 80-year-old William Mackenzie shared his experiences alongside a video interview with Takeshi Yamamoto, conducted in Japan in 1998 before his death. "We were young men fighting for our countries," Yamamoto reflected in the interview, speaking in English that retained only the faintest trace of an accent after decades of post-war business dealings with American companies. The infiltration program seems almost naive now, the idea that linguistic training could overcome the cultural depth that defines identity. But at the time, we believed we could become American enough to deceive. We were wrong, but we were sincere in our effort. The exhibition sparked renewed academic interest in the infiltration campaign. Dr. Sarah Chen, a linguistics professor at Stanford University, published comprehensive analysis in 2006 that placed the World War II verification system in broader historical context. Throughout history, Chen wrote, language has served as both bridge and barrier between peoples. The Pacific Infiltration Campaign represents a unique moment when linguistic differences became explicit defensive tools. The Americans weaponized their own cultural identity, turning natural variations in language acquisition into an effective security system. Chen's research noted that modern technology had made the infiltration tactics of 1942 largely obsolete. Voice analysis software could detect subtle phonetic patterns. Databases could instantly verify identities, and biometric systems provided authentication that no amount of training could defeat. Yet the fundamental principle remained relevant. authentic. Belonging to a culture involves countless unconscious patterns that resist perfect replication. The story also resonated in contemporary debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and national identity. The verification system had been based on the premise that American identity could be tested and verified through specific cultural knowledge and linguistic patterns, an assumption that seemed both pragmatically necessary in wartime and philosophically troubling in peacetime. In 2012, a joint American-Japanese historical conference in Honolulu brought together scholars from both nations to examine the infiltration campaign from multiple perspectives. Professor Hiroshi Nakamura, grandson of Major Kenji Nakamura, who had designed the infiltration program, presented research based on his grandfather's personal papers. My grandfather believed he was serving his country by preparing these young men for an impossible mission, Nakamura explained. He recognized by 1943 that the program had failed. Not because the soldiers weren't brave or dedicated, but because he had asked them to become something that cannot be manufactured through training alone. His private writings revealed deep regret for sending men into situations where linguistic limitations made detection almost inevitable. By 2020, as World War II veterans entered their final years, oral history projects worked urgently to preserve their memories. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress collected hundreds of accounts related to the infiltration war, creating an archive for future generations. Among these testimonies was a 2020 interview with 98-year-old James Rodriguez, the Texas corporal who had detected some of the last infiltrators in April 1943, using the word Lollapalooza. Confined to a wheelchair, but mentally sharp, Rodriguez reflected on the experience that had defined his youth. "People ask me if I'm proud of catching those infiltrators," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of contemplation. "Pride isn't quite the right word. I did my duty, and I'm glad I protected my fellow soldiers. But I also think about those Japanese boys, and they were boys, just like me, who died because they couldn't pronounce an English word correctly. War makes heroes and victims out of everyone, and sometimes the line between them is just a word you can't say right." Rodriguez's reflection captured the moral complexity that historical distance made visible. The verification system had been militarily necessary and operationally effective, saving American lives and protecting military security. But it had also been part of a larger machinery of war that reduced human beings to linguistic tests, that made pronunciation a matter of life and death, and that drew stark lines between us and them based on cultural markers. The infiltration story's final chapter was written not in military victories or intelligence triumphs, but in reconciliation and understanding. In 2022, 80 years after the infiltration program's peak, a joint memorial ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. American and Japanese officials, veterans from both nations, and family members of those who had served gathered to honor all who had been caught in the shadow war of identity and deception. The ceremony included the planting of a Japanese cherry tree near the Pacific Theater Memorial, symbolizing the peace and alliance that had grown from wartime enmity. Speeches acknowledged both the legitimate security concerns that had driven the verification program and the human cost of reducing identity to testable markers. Ambassador Kenji Yamamoto III, great-nephew of the infiltrator Takeshi Yamamoto, and current Japanese ambassador to the United States, delivered remarks that brought many attendees to tears. "My great-uncle served his country as he understood his duty," Yamamoto said. "The American soldiers who detected infiltrators served their country with equal dedication. Both sides were trapped in the logic of war, where survival demanded seeing each other as threats rather than as fellow human beings. Today, we honor their service while celebrating the peace that allows us to see each other as friends." The ceremony concluded with a linguistic scholar reading aloud a list of words that had been used for verification during war. Lollapalooza, aluminum, squirrel, brewery, literature, regularly. Each word was pronounced carefully in both American English and Japanese accented English, highlighting the phonetic differences that had once meant life or death. The reading served as both historical documentation and symbolic reconciliation, acknowledging the reality of linguistic difference while refusing to let it divide. As the sun set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones, those gathered understood that the story of Japanese infiltrators and the Lollapalooza test was ultimately a story about the complexity of identity, the power of language, and the human capacity for both conflict and reconciliation. It was a reminder that in war, even words become weapons, but in peace, those same words can build bridges of understanding. The infiltration campaign of World War II and the verification techniques developed to combat it remain relevant in the 21st century, not as a tactical manual for security procedures, but as a meditation on what defines belonging, identity, and trust in times of crisis. The word Lollapalooza, once a barrier between friend and foe, has become a symbol of how cultural knowledge shapes our understanding of who we are and who we perceive others to be. For the soldiers who stood at those checkpoints in the Pacific Islands, asking strangers to pronounce difficult words, the experience shaped the rest of their lives. For the infiltrators who trained for years to pass as Americans, only to be undone by phonetic patterns established in childhood, the experience represented both the limits of preparation and the unexpected ways war tests human capability. And for historians studying the episode decades later, it offers lessons about innovation under pressure, the weaponization of culture, and the enduring challenge of balancing security with humanity, lessons that remain profoundly relevant in an age of new technologies, new threats, and continuing questions about identity and belonging in an interconnected world. The verified historical record, when examined carefully and honestly, reveals both the achievements and limitations of pronunciation testing as a security measure. It worked at Guadalcanal and across the Pacific Theater, providing sentries with a quick and reliable method for identifying potential infiltrators. It made perfect sense given the linguistic realities of Japanese and English phonological systems. But it was not a perfect system, not a comprehensive program without flaws, and not without moral complications that deserve acknowledgement. The Marines and soldiers who developed and implemented these verification procedures deserve recognition for their practical innovation under extraordinary pressure. They faced an enemy who had invested years in preparation, who carried perfect documents, who spoke fluent English, and who looked for any vulnerability in American defenses. The linguistic verification system emerged from necessity, evolved through experience, and proved effective because it exploited something infiltrators genuinely could not fake: the deep phonetic patterns of native language acquisition. The story reminds us that military success depends on countless small innovations developed by those facing immediate problems and finding practical solutions. The recognition that language differences could be exploited for identification purposes demonstrated intelligence, flexibility, and creativity. The systematic use of L-based passwords represented genuine innovation that addressed a real security challenge in an environment where traditional methods had proven inadequate. At the same time, the story requires us to acknowledge the broader context: the unjust internment of Japanese Americans, the moral complexity of reducing identity to linguistic tests, and the psychological toll on both those who administered the tests and those who faced them. History is rarely simple, and the infiltration story, like so much of World War II, contains both achievement and tragedy, innovation and injustice, heroism and harm. Today, the shadow war, fought with words rather than bullets, has ended, but its echoes continue, reminding each generation that language is more than communication. It is identity, heritage, and belonging, carrying within it the marks of where we come from and who we truly are. The word Lollapalooza, once a test that determined life and death, now stands as a monument to a specific moment in history, when pronunciation patterns became a battlefield, when the unconscious structures of childhood language acquisition proved more powerful than years of training, and when American forces turned the fundamental nature of human language into a defensive weapon. The men who served at those checkpoints, both the American sentries who challenged approaching figures and the Japanese infiltrators who attempted to deceive them, were caught in circumstances beyond their control. They fought with the tools available to them, whether those tools were rifles and grenades or carefully practiced English pronunciation. They served their nations, did their duty as they understood it, and paid the price that all wars demand. We remember them not just as participants in a tactical innovation, but as human beings caught in humanity's oldest tragedy, the need to distinguish friend from enemy, the requirement to make life and death decisions in seconds, and the burden of carrying those decisions for the rest of their lives. Their story, carefully documented and honestly told, honors both their service and their humanity, acknowledging what they achieved while recognizing the complexity of what they faced. The lesson of Lollapalooza endures not in the specific tactical application, but in what it reveals about language, identity, and the countless unconscious patterns that make us who we are. In the end, the infiltrators were discovered not because they lacked dedication or training, but because they were asking the impossible to erase the linguistic patterns of childhood and replace them with something learned as adults. The American forces who developed the verification system understood this fundamental truth about human language, perhaps instinctively rather than consciously, and used that understanding to protect themselves and their comrades. It was innovation born of necessity, effective in its application, and worthy of historical examination that is both thorough and honest, acknowledging effectiveness without ignoring complexity, recognizing achievement without forgetting cost, and preserving memory with the nuance that truth demands. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.